So now we are going to look at the sales mix when we consider total sales dollars. So remember, based on the prior video, when we did the sales mix based on units, that was maybe for a company or industry where they don't have a lot of volume. Okay, we move to total sales when we're talking about a company that has a lot of volume. Okay, but remember, no matter which one we use, at the end of the day, it's not going to change the calculation of break even on a company-wide basis. It's just changing the measure that we're using. Now, sales mix itself will change, and we'll take a quick look at that. So in this example, we're looking at the same set of data, except for now we're just saying let's base it off of total sales. Okay, so unit contribution margin, again, another good review, that doesn't change. So selling price for the pair of shoes minus variable cost. Selling price for the pair of gloves minus variable cost. And sales price for the rangefinder minus variable cost. Now, how do we calculate total sales? Okay, so total sales is selling price per unit times the actual quantity of units sold. Okay, so we're going to do the same thing for each of these. So selling price times quantity and selling price times quantity. For variable cost, we have our unit variable cost times quantity. And if you haven't worked in Excel much, this would be a good way to start getting acclimated with some of the formulas. All right, so now that I have these individual amounts, let's not forget about how do we calculate contribution margin. So I'm going to do it the quick way. Sales minus variable cost for each of these items. All right, so now over here, I'm looking at the total company-wide information, okay? Because this is going to be key for what I'm going to be using for my sales mix and also to demonstrate contribution margin on a weighted average basis. So I'm just taking the sum of these. Okay, so my total sales are 7.75 million. Variable cost is 5.65 million, and my contribution margin on a total company basis is 2.1. Okay, so again, let's talk sales mix. So really what I'm focused on is this here. Okay, how much as a percentage of total sales are my shoes, gloves, and rangefinder in comparison to the total company? So how do I find that? I just take my total sales dollars divided by the total company sales dollars. And so you see I'm pretty close. Now it's going to look a little bit different compared to unit sales mix for these others, for gloves and rangefinders. Why? Well, because with total sales, we're now introducing two components, not only quantity, but price. Oops, and here I did the wrong formula. So 2.5 divided by the total. And oh, what is happening here? All right, now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to show you a little shortcut here and to make sure that I have this expressed as a percentage. That changed on me there for some weird reason. Okay, so now when I look at this, these are my sales mixes. Again, if I add these up, they equal 100%. They got to equal 100. I'm only selling these 3 items. Okay, so basically what we're saying is that while the sales mix represents 58%, we're still looking at that contribution margin, but now what I want to do is actually apply it to my contribution margin ratio. So as we work through this and we're talking, sorry, my dogs are going crazy. As we're talking total sales mix compared to contribution margin ratio. hopefully that will help. We'll see. Okay, sorry about that delay. All right, contribution margin ratio. So I've got my contribution margin for my shoes divided by my total sales dollars, and that's how I come up with my ratio. Now, remember what we said with units. Even though that this is 21% for the shoes is my contribution margin ratio, okay, I'm only getting 58% of the benefit of that. Why? Well, because my sales mix and total sales dollars represents 58%. Okay, so keeping that in mind, how do I calculate the weighted average? Well, similar to what I did with units, I'm just going to take my 21% contribution margin ratio for shoes and take that times my sales mix. So the weighted average across the company is only 12%. Okay, so let's do this again with gloves. Contribution margin ratio is the contribution margin of gloves divided by the total sales dollars, or 52%, but we're only getting 10% of that benefit. Okay, so on a weighted average basis, I'm really only contributing 5% to the contribution margin when I take into account sales mix. And then finally for the rangefinder, contribution margin divided by sales. Okay, that's my contribution margin ratio. But then when I apply the sales mix percentage, it's kind of an interesting little tidbit here that we see. The weighted average of the rangefinder is higher. Well, that's because the price is so much higher, okay? Especially when we compare that to gloves. Now, it doesn't really make sense to add these up, okay? Because if we added the contribution margin ratio up, 103% contribution margin ratio, that really doesn't make sense. Instead, if I add up the weighted average, 27%, now that looks a little bit better, okay? And if I look at that, when I compare to each individual contribution margin ratio percentage, okay, 27% makes sense because it's somewhere in between all of those, okay? Now, I could actually double check this by taking my total company contribution margin divided by my total sales, and they agree. And that makes sense because I can look at it on a total company-wide basis, and I can still look at it individually, but I can't forget about applying that sales mix. All right, so now let's move on down here. When we discussed in chapter 18, finding break-even sales dollars, what did we do? Well, we took the fixed cost, they didn't change, so 690,000, divided by the contribution margin for the total company, or the sum of the weighted average contribution margin ratios for each of our products. So now, just real quick, here's my break-even sales dollars. I'm going to come back and look at our sales mix that we did per unit. And guess what? Break-even sales are the same. We're just getting to them a little bit different way. Okay. So once I know that, again, I could take my total company sales times my sales mix. I always go back to that sales mix. Okay. Do that the same for pair of gloves or pairs of gloves. And I could do the same for rangefinders. Okay, now let's just make sure. If I grab these and add them all up, look down here, 2.5, 46, 428, 57. Okay, and remember, we'd always round up just to make sure we're covering to get to that break-even point. So now is my question for you. If this is my break-even sales in dollars, how could I calculate units from here? Well, remember, total sales dollars is selling price per unit times units. So how I can calculate this is simply take my break-even sales dollars and go back up and grab my selling price for a pair of shoes, and I've got my break-even sales units. Real quick, let's come over here and look at what we did before. There's our break-even units. Okay, so these have to be ultimately the same. So I'm going to come over here. I'm going to apply the same formula. Break-even sales dollars divided by selling price per unit. Same with my rangefinder divided by selling price per unit. Okay, and I'm going to add these up. And if I just look real quick, these are the same, okay? So 2 different ways to get to it, depends on what the question is asking. Now, can we verify the sales mix of dollars at break even? Absolutely, okay? So guess what? Break even sales dollars. I'm actually just gonna make that equal this because that's the same thing, right? Now, if you're thinking, haven't we seen this before? Yes, absolutely we have, okay? So these are the same. They're not going to be any different, okay? Why? Well, we just arrived at this information in a little bit different way. One, we took into account total sales. The other, we took into account units. So as you go through and calculate the rest of this information on your own, use it for practice, but essentially this has to be the exact same as what we've done here. That will not differ. And that applies to this entire section. It will be the same. All right, so we're going to stop here and I am going to do a quick video on limited resources and we'll wrap up chapter 18. Sorry, we're already on chapter 19. We're going to wrap up chapter 19.